Hello, everybody. Welcome to our 33rd meetup and the last of the semester. Thank you for joining us today on this lovely summer evening. My name is Salma Esteves. I research and teach data visualization and infographics at the Lisbon School of Architecture, and I'm just a tiny part of data visualization Lisboa. As you might know, we are a group of professionals and enthusiasts who love bringing together experts who love visualization as much as we do and who have fascinating things to teach us. Today, we welcome Professor Murray Dick. He teaches multimedia journalism at Newcastle University and authored the book, The Infographic, A History of Data Graphics in News and Communications, which is one of my personal favorites. As per usual, this session will end with a Q&A, so prepare your questions and feel free to post them whenever you want. So welcome, Maury. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Salome. It's much appreciated.
Thanks. Please share you can share your presentation.
Will do. Okay. Okay. So can you see my presentation? It's just loading.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay. Fantastic.
Yeah,
okay.
Well, the stage is yours. See you in a bit.
Brilliant. Okay. Yes, indeed. Okay. So thank you, Salome, for having me here, and thank you all for tuning in. So I'm Dr. Murray Dick. I'm at Newcastle University in the UK. It's in the northeast of the UK. And I am a journalism studies scholar. And I'm going to talk a little today about methods of analysis in data visualization. And I'm going to make a confession before I begin. I'm conscious of the people who normally frequent these series of interviews and presentations, and I know that quite a few of you are actually professional visualization experts. Well, I'm here today to confess that I have no skills in that direction whatsoever. Though interestingly, my dad was a civil engineer and was a pretty mean technical drawer. And my eldest son has a bit of talent in this direction too. He's just 10. He did this a year or so ago. I'm just going to show you this. Wham. Okay. How do I fit into the field of data visualization? Well, it's kind of at arm's length, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about my background and how I got to where I got to, which I hope will help you make sense of what I'm going to propose in terms of methods of analysis in data visualization. So this is my next slide. It's just this kind of skeleton outline of my professional career. So in 2002, I studied an MSc in Information Science at City University in London. And some of you, I'm sure, may be familiar with one or two of the lecturers who ran and continue to run this course. One of them is Professor Joe Wood. I spent a year at City learning about information, about the science of information, and including, of course, how one represents data representations, different methods of data representation. And that really was the first time that I started to think, shall we say, in any sort of depth about data visualizations. Of course, I was familiar with them from reading them in the news. I was an avid reader of the news, but I'd never really thought much about them until that course. Okay, so when I graduated from that master's, I then went to work in the media, and I worked at the BBC for just about 5 years as a researcher and a trainer. And I used to train journalists in how to do online research. And so I spent quite a bit of time in newsrooms and finding out how journalists do what they do. And that was all really interesting and useful. And I began to think a little bit about how the pressures of the newsroom and the competing expectations that are placed on journalists, visual journalists too, in terms of how they do what they do and so on and so forth. And then I spent a year as a trainer and as an information officer at the Centre for Investigative Journalism in London as well. That was also at City at the time. It's now at Goldsmiths in London. And then from there, I moved into the academy. I've had my first of 2 jobs in higher education. I started at Brunel University in West London as a lecturer in journalism. And then about 7 years ago now, I moved up to Newcastle, as I say, in the northeast of England. And that's where I've been ever since. And so through that time, really, I've been trying to make sense of how data visualization sits within the wider scheme of what journalists do, both in terms of ethics and in terms of aesthetics. Okay, and so being a research active academic, I spend a fair bit of my professional time reading. From time to time, I'll do some archive research, and so it was, I don't know, maybe about 6, 7, 8 years ago now, I started doing some quite comprehensive archives research into infographics and what they used to look like. And really, I started with a very broad research question of how did we get from the various forms that existed in the early stages of news production and design to where we are today. And these 2 examples that I'm showing you now, I think, kind of speak to that move. The one you can see on your left is one really that started opening up a lot of interesting questions for me about how news infographics emerged, particularly in the UK. What you're looking at is a line graph featuring 5 different variables. Okay, and each of these variables corresponds to a professional grouping in society. And what you're looking at is the deaths per I think it's at 1,500. It's a per capita death rate for infant mortality. Okay, and you can see, you looking at the horizontal axis, you can see it's 1911 to 1950, and on the vertical axis, you can probably see some rather crazy looking scaling going on. And you can well imagine, I'm sure some of you are probably mapping out in your minds right now what this chart should actually look like if it was done with regular scaling. And of course, when you do, you realize it tells a very different story. This line was used, this graph was used in a comment piece in the Daily Express in 1959 to basically argue that the changes that have been made since the development of what we call collective healthcare in the UK, or the NHS, had relatively little impact on the poorest in society. Everyone was benefiting seemingly in a similar way. You can see all the lines are coming down in a broadly similar way. But of course, if you map it properly, if you scale things properly, you see that the real beneficiaries of various medical advances, but also the NHS, were the poorest in society. And of course, that's what it was intended to be. And so this whole idea of, if you like, infographic propaganda in this case, the Daily Express, started some interesting questions. And I thought to myself, doing more research, I became aware that in the UK, the first real attempt to sort of serialize infographics in UK news was the Daily Express. And some of the figures around those advances went on to have very illustrious and celebrated careers in Fleet Street, in the newspaper industry in the UK. And I thought, well, this requires a little bit of revision. This is interesting. How do we get from these, let's say, stylistic and stylish, but rather misleading infographics on the left, to the sorts of graphics that we see on the right? This is a Society of News Designers 2020 winner. How did we get from A to B? That's what I'm interested in. How, and also, how do we get from being a public, a sort of mass society of understanding infographics, understanding when we're being misled, understanding how things work, and what do we make of the methods of communication? So really, it's partly about ethics and standards, best practice, okay, of which there are many different voices who have different things to say. but it's also about aesthetics. What are these symbols you see again on the left? The infographic is it's a kind of classic fever chart, isn't it? And it's a literal fever chart. It's a metaphor of a fever chart that you might see in the 1950s at the end of a patient's bed in a hospital. And it's rather a clumsy metaphor in some ways, but there are other metaphors in infographics, some of which are actually quite subtle and move us in various ways. And so really what I'm getting to is, yes, we know there are standards of best practice, and yes, there's quite a lot that we can agree upon. There's other things that we may not agree upon. But how do we go about analyzing the aesthetics in infographics? The looks, the meanings, and what you might call the polysemy, the multiple meanings that exist in metaphors and in various other visual communications. And so I started to think a little bit. I've written this book. It came out in 2020. It's the history of infographics in the UK news industry, particularly. How do I turn that from a standalone book on a bookshelf into a kind of vehicle for teaching? How do I turn this into a pedagogy? And it became apparent, I really needed a method of analysis to sort of move away from the idea of the studying infographics in a sort of historical milieu, but to actually thinking about how we make sense of them and how students might make sense of them when they're actually trying to study these things. And so really that's where this is coming from. And actually, for the rest of what I'm going to look at, the rest of the slides that I'm looking at in this presentation, I'm really drawing upon a chapter from my current book that I'm writing at the moment. It's contracted to SAGE methodologies, and it's basically going to look at the model that I'm going to show to you, and it's going to consider it in the context of some of the other approaches that I'm going to introduce now. So, as I say, just to repeat, the idea is, the problem that I have is I need a method of analysis that might bring different voices together. And here I'm thinking of, what you might call the usual suspects, those pioneers in standards of best practice from the sciences, from statistics, from maths, from the physical sciences. How do we bring those voices and those principles of design into the context of news design and the very different, if you like, epistemology, ways of thinking, ways of knowing that exist in the newsroom around deadlines, around liberal journalistic values, and various other things. Okay, so there's lots of methods out there, right? There's lots of places to start. You can look in the arts, you can look in the social sciences. There are one or two interdisciplinary approaches. So where to begin? So basically what I'm going to do now, possibly for the next 20 to 30 minutes, is just to go through some of the different ways that exist out there already that have been used and that have emerged from different fields, and to try and get a sense of how those might help us to make sense of the infographics that you guys produce and that we and the wider public consume, and to try and get a sense of where meanings emerge and how this may help. So as I say, the focus in today's session is not really, I don't really want to think too much about standards, although I will mention them from time to time. It's really about the aesthetics rather than the ethics that I'm concerned with here. So I'm going to start with what you might call a common sense approach that emerges in the arts, and I'm referencing here a book by two authors from the arts, House and Negreiros, 2003. I will share my references at the end of these slides. A common sense approach to analysing, in this case, on the right-hand side, you can see a visualization. It's an electro visualization. Okay, so what you're looking at on the right-hand side is a full-page illustration from the Illustrated London News, Saturday, the 8th of November, 1924. It is a depiction of, it's what you might call the kind of stream of political toing and froing, waxing and waning between the Conservatives and Liberals, and then eventually the Conservatives and the Labour Party as time progresses. And you can see all the way back, if you move your eyes right the way to the top of this illustration, That takes us to 1832 and the Great Reform Act, which is effectively when large-scale voting was, sort of largely took off in the UK. Okay, so let's think a little bit about this illustration in the context of the heuristics, for want of a better word, the methods that are set out in a common sense approach to analysing visual art. Okay, so first of all, we think of genre. Okay, and so what is the genre of this illustration? Well, you could say that it's an illustrated naturalistic kind of depiction, isn't it? It's I wouldn't quite call it still life, but it's certainly it's naturalistic. It's illustrated, so it's true to life. What's the subject matter? Well, it's political suffrage. It's like which way the body politic has shifted over history. And then thirdly, you think of locative factors. You think of history, seasonal setting, time of day, immediacy, and so on. And you're beginning probably, I hope, to get a sense that this particular method of analysis emerged in the arts to do with analysing naturalistic works of art. Okay, so some of them are appropriate here and some of them aren't. Okay, so the seasonal setting, I guess you could say, is kind of relevant here. You can see, I hope, a very kind of unapologetic bias in this illustration. The Illustrated London News was a conservative-leaning newspaper, and you can see that the way the river waxes towards the Conservatives on the right-hand side, you can see that the right-hand side is bathed in sunshine, whereas the left-hand side, the Liberals, and eventually as you get down to the turn of the 20th century, the Labour Party, you can see that's a little more shadowy and darker. Okay, those are the dark lands, those are the cloudy lands. And so as I say, this kind of really unapologetic bias is carried very clearly in the seasonal setting, or at least in the presentation, the sort of seasonal aspect of this particular thing. And so this is a starting point, but the problem with this particular common sense approach is its vagueness. Some of the terminology is very vague, means different things in different contexts, and in addition, as we've just seen, some of the if you like, filters or the sort of factors involved aren't really applicable to non-naturalistic representational depictions of art. Okay, so it's a start, but it's not perfect. Okay, here is a second method of analysis from the School of Art, from the field of art history. It's called Iconology, and it was developed by an art historian called Erwin Panofsky, who set out this approach in 1939. And really, he was interested in kind of picking out the meanings, the symbolism and the symbolic meanings inherent in different works of art. And so he proposed a three-stage process, and I'm going to use that three-stage process to think through the graphic on the right. You can see this is a full-page graphic from the Sphere. The Sphere is a little like the Illustrated London News. It's also a right-wing newspaper, illustrated, aimed at a lower middle class with a bit of disposable income. Right, as I say, conservative-leaning, conservative in spirit. It's published in 1912. Those of you who are familiar with the world of shipping will immediately recognize that year as being significant. And of course, as the headline gives away, this is about the loss of the Titanic. And this is very timely for me, actually, because though I'm normally based in Newcastle in England for my professional life, I'm actually in Belfast. I'm actually in Northern Ireland at the moment on holiday. And on Tuesday, I went to Belfast and I went to the Titanic Museum in Belfast, which is a really interesting, interactive experience. It's one of the most kind of progressive and engaging exhibitions I think I've ever been to. It was extraordinary. But anyway, this is about the Titanic. It's about the loss of life on the Titanic. Okay, and you can see, well, let's go through the iconological steps. Okay, so there are 3 steps in iconology. The first is to form a dispassionate description of the visual data. Now here, the visual data are represented in a negative positive bar chart. It's not quite a bar chart, it's more like a block chart. And you can see the dividing lines, the black and the white kind of contrast against each other in quite a compelling way. The deaths, of course, are depicted in black on the left-hand side of the zero axis, the vertical axis that runs down just off center, and the white blocks represent those who lived. Okay, so that's I would say, a fairly dispassionate description of the visual data. The second step is to run what Panofsky called an iconographical analysis. Okay, and that helps us to determine the genres and the categories that these things belong to. And here, I guess you could say the genre is a form of simple infographic design. Again, it's not quite a bar chart, but it does build. It's kind of like a kind of building block chart, I suppose. But the idea really is to get across, you know, a sense of the lives involved in this event, both those lost and those saved, in a graphical form, in a simple, you know, sort of like shapes for design. Okay, so the third step then is to run what Panofsky called an iconological interpretation. Okay, and the idea here is to situate what you're looking at within the social, cultural, and historical context within which it was produced. Okay, so here, I guess, again, this is a field that's open to interpretation. And so you may go a different way from me on this. You may interpret this in a different way from me. But what I found most interesting, and I try not to be too overly skeptical about these sorts of things, but what I find interesting about this is the final collection, the total, if you like, of those who died and those who survived. And they're organized by gender and by age. But what is interesting for me from a, if you like, a kind of social, cultural, and historical context is, and again, I'm drawing on what I experienced when I went to the exhibition in Belfast a couple of days ago. Okay, so you'll probably be aware of this, but the experience of the Titanic journey, of the Titanic, if you like, consumer experience was very rigidly stratified into classes. You know, you had first class who, you know, sort of like moved in the lap of luxury. You had second class who obviously didn't have quite so luxurious situation. Then you had third class, and so on. Okay, there was well, I say so on. There were, I don't think there were many other classes than that, but really those classes spoke to very different experiences in as I say, the journey experience that you would have on the Titanic. And of course, those different experiences don't really speak to a sense of solidarity. So it's interesting, I think, that what you have and what seems to be the area of the chart that draws your eyes to is this final section where it seems that death has provided a sense of solidarity to those people where there was no sense of solidarity in real life, if you like, or at least in the lived experience, you know, which in itself is an interesting way to look at this. So that's iconology. That's another way from the arts to look at analyzing visual data. Now, the problem with iconology is this emphasis on the symbolic and a tendency to ignore the formal aspects of the designs that you're looking at. So you can probably see now, the first one that we looked at, the common sense approach, tends to make a little too much of the formal components because it comes out of you know, if you like, a kind of way of thinking about visual data that arises from focusing on naturalistic depictions of things. And then you compare that with the iconology, and that's much more concerned with symbolism. You know, it's much less concerned with the formal aspects. And so I put these two to begin with, really, to give you a sense of how useful it can be, really, and how important it is to kind of bring together the formal and the symbolic. Okay, a third method of analysis from the arts, gestalt theory. which arises at the turn of the 20th century. It's psychological theory. It's tied up with the Vienna Circle and a lot of the intellectual work that was going on around Vienna at the turn of the 20th century. Okay, and so the idea of gestalt theory, again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, is not to focus overly on the minutiae of a particular visual display. That is to sort of focus in on a particular area, and kind of ignore everything else going on. On the contrary, the idea of gestalt really is to consider everything in its connectedness, to consider a work of art in its terms of its interconnectedness, of the different components that exist within it, or that are given voice within it. Okay, and so the sorts of things that gestalt theory looks to make sense of when you're looking at an infographic like this, for example, might be things like similarity. So things that are similar, either in size, shape, direction, orientation, color, can have associative meanings that arise from that similarity. Similarly, continuation, the uninterrupted flow of your line of vision across the field of a data visualization can provide you at an intersection point with a site of analysis. Then you have enclosure in terms of what bounds or visual boundaries exist around depiction. You have proximity between different factors, which again can provide associative meanings. The figure ground idea, the idea of a figure in the foreground against the background, and symmetry or asymmetry. So here I'm just gonna do a quick kind of quick and dirty analysis of the infographic on the right. You can see, which is taken from the Daily Express in 1965. It's much more, let's say, naturalistically pictorial, or in elements of it are, than a lot of the designs in the 50s were. So basically, what I think is quite interesting here, just to pick up on one of these gestalt principles, the idea of continuation, where the eye moves. For me, and again, there's an element of kind of personal experience here. For me, my eye follows the white mine shaft that moves horizontally across from the top left of this image, all the way across to just past the midpoint, and then there is that intersection with the other part of the shaft, the part of the mine shaft, and you can see that. And really there, for me, there is seems to be a site of analysis, because following that down, you get this sense of the tragedy of the story that's being told here, which is about a mining disaster. It's about the collapse of a mining pit in 1965. And as I say, you have the naturalistic visual clue in terms of the miners with the mining hats. And you've got the shaft on the left-hand side, where you can see there are bodies falling down. But as I say, really, it's all kind of the eye, the continuation of the eye is really sort of like formed around that joist, that kind of meeting point of the pit, which obviously has given way. So again, gestalt theory can be really useful in terms of developing meanings, or of eliciting meanings out of visualization in aesthetic terms here. The problem being, though, of course, sometimes these things are a little perhaps more descriptive than analytical. And again, there's an element of vagueness. Some of these concepts can sort of blur into each other a little bit sometimes, depending on how you've interpreted them. But of course, that is the risk of developing a method of analysis from the arts, where interpretation is king. Okay, so the next one I want to talk about, I'm not going to actually perform an analysis here because I don't have anything interactive with me to do so, but this is the reason that the heading of this slide is in purple is because I want to tease out a sense of commonality, and this is my first method which has arisen from the field of data visualization. Okay, so some of you, I hope, will be familiar with Manovich's work, Lev Manovich. He's been, researching a long time in the field of data visualization. He's given us quite a lot of really useful intellectual and analytical tools that can be used specifically for exploring interactivity in data visualization. And he has provided us with this, as I say, this overview of cultural analytics. Okay, so just to explain a little bit about this for those of you who may not be familiar, the field of cultural analytics comes about because what Manovich calls graphical primitives, points, bars, lines, curves, aren't always a good fit for exploring visual data. Okay, sometimes you actually need to see the visual data in interactive terms to elicit meanings from it, to develop new knowledge from it. Okay, and so he talks in his earlier work about direct visualization or media visualization, which involves creating new visual representations from the actual visual media objects, that's in this case images or video, or their parts. Okay, and the image you can see on the right is taken from a YouTube video. It's a cultural analysis of Mark Rothko's paintings. Okay, so it's an interactive collection of Rothko's paintings through his artistic career, and this particular these two methods, direct visualization or media visualization, can be used, as I say, to elicit new meanings and new knowledge from, in this case, interactive material. Of course, it's best suited to collections of visualizations where you have lots and lots of data. Okay, so it's a useful tool, a very useful tool, and as I say, something that I may refer back to in future slides. Okay, so much for the arts. So those four methods all came from the arts. I just want to talk very quickly about one interdisciplinary method of analysis that comes from the field of visual ethnography. Okay, and in this case, again, we think about analyzing a visualization in terms of a series of heuristics, for want of a better word. Just kind of a checklist of tools that helps you think your way around a problem in a systematic way. Okay, and so in visual ethnography, there's a tendency to draw upon some semiotic concepts, but there's also a tendency to look at the idea of phenomenology, which is the idea of how things are experienced by the individual. So there's quite an interesting focus there, potentially, on sites of consumption and the ways that people engage and the meanings that they elicit from the visualizations that they engage with. Okay, so the sorts of heuristics that are used in visual ethnography might include things like agency, one actor's influence on another in a particular situation in a visualization, or they might be to do with data and the objects of sociological attention for those anthropologists who are a little squeamish about, kind of like scientific concepts like data. Again, the figure ground component can be interesting, can yield some interesting perspectives. You have frame, inclusion or exclusion. You have narrative, sequential nature of data, so on and so forth. Ocular centrism, where you think a little bit about that can be either neutral or critical depending on your epistemology, but focusing on the eye as I guess a method for conveying knowledge or information as opposed to other senses. And then you have perspective, seeing, knowing, and personal agency, and so on. Okay, and if you wanted to apply some of these principles to an infographic, I've got one here from The Economist from 1954. This is an attempt to try and make sense of the UK in terms of its constituent classes. You can probably see it's quite a small infographic, but you can probably see that it's pretty self-evident what's going on. There's a key at the top which explains which gives us kind of summary overview of the 7 classes that exist in society back in 1954, and then the second component just below that gives a sense of proportionately how these classes are divided in society. And you can probably see, if you focus in, that it's skilled manual and those working in skilled manual trades and so on who predominate in society. Now, interestingly, below that, you have an analysis of essentially the social mobility of each of these classes. Okay, and again, that tells a story, a potentially interesting story in terms of movement, between how the generations of these different classes in society are shifting and moving. And so, as I say, you might, for this one, a particularly interesting way of thinking about this, a heuristic from visual ethnography may be this idea of data as an objective of sociological attention. What is the sociology of this representation in terms of thinking about class in society? Now, being a pragmatist, I'm quite keen on bridging gaps between different fields and different ways of knowing, but there will be some people, specifically in the field of visual ethnography, who will struggle to kind of come to terms with the idea that you can both foreground semiotics and the meaning of signs, and you can at the same time foreground phenomenology and people's experience of reality. Okay, some people will say, some ethnographers will say, well, pick your horse. You can't have it both ways. You've got to choose. And for a lot of visual ethnographers, it's phenomenology. It's all about the lived experience, right? So that's a challenge. This is a challenge that we face in trying to make sense of these things. Okay, so moving swiftly on. Here is a method of analysis from the social sciences. Okay, I'm going to start with this because it's actually got little in common with the ones that follow. Now, cultural studies analysis is an opportunistic, shall we say, a method of analysis. Okay, so if you wanted to make sense of a visualization like this, the one on the right, using a cultural studies mode of analysis, then it can take you into some quite interesting directions. It will also take you away in some cases from a rigorous, consistent method of analysis, but it can take you into some interesting spaces. So just a quick overview of the cultural studies approach to analysis of visual data. It's anti-positivist. Okay, the researcher cannot stand outside of the process of observation, and so by definition, the process of research is part of the power structures in society. Okay, you can't objectively observe. Secondly, cultural studies analysis is all about promoting equality, creating knowledge towards political change. So it's fundamentally ideological, and it tends to avoid detailed or explicit discussion of analytical methods, and it certainly doesn't tie itself exclusively to certain methods. As I say, it's quite it's happy to use different methods in order so that they can kind of allow cultural studies to reach the conclusions that it seeks to reach. Okay, so let's think about this way of analyzing visual data in terms of the graph on the right. Okay, so I've taken this graph from a book by Steven Pinker, the popular, you might call him a kind of public intellectual. This is from a book he wrote called The Better Angels of Our Nature. The Better Angels of Our Nature is if you're not familiar with it, is one of it's one, if you like, in a series of books that really tries to make the most of the idea of enlightenment. Okay, so Pinker's thrust, the whole point of his argument is that with the Enlightenment, we turned our back on arbitrariness, on shall we say, feudal living. We turn towards reason, and subsequently things are getting better. Okay, and Pinker likes to focus on the areas of life that are getting better. And so here we have a graph, and it's a graph. It's a graph that attempts to depict the argument, the visual argument, if you like, that Europe is getting less violent. Okay, so we can talk, if we were thinking about the ethics or the standards involved in this graph, we might want to talk about, for example, the scaling on the vertical axis, which is not linear. Or we might want to talk about methodologies, how reliable how reliable is the data that we have about the nature of violence? How is violence defined historically and going back in different ways? And some people may argue that homicide is merely one representation, one way of thinking about violence. But others will actually, and those particularly from a cultural studies point of view, will actually argue that, or could argue that, the very premise that Pinker is pushing with this and using this graph to support the idea that the Enlightenment was a move towards, rationality and away from violence, is in itself misguided because, well, for starters, a number of key Enlightenment figures were not perhaps as enlightened in terms of violence as may be the case. And certainly also you could argue that various other deadly, let's say, ideologies emerged, particularly in the 20th century, came about, and the ideas for them emerged during the Enlightenment too. So that might be a cultural studies approach to analysing this particular graph by Pinker. Now, the problem, as you can probably guess from this method of analysis, is that the results are predetermined by the researcher's ideological positioning. Yeah, so if positivism isn't possible, then I guess all you have is ideology. So again, for some people, that understandably will not be a method that you might want to use. Okay, so in the social sciences, I mentioned that cultural studies kind of sticks out a little. Here are three more methods of analysis from the field of social sciences. I won't bang on about them too much. I'll just pass relatively quickly through them because I know that I've been talking for quite a while now. The first I want to bring up is semiotics. Again, I'm sure it's the name Bart is, I'm sure, familiar to some of you. Bart's ideas have been going around actually for a lot longer than 1977. But so Bart's semiotics are quite simple. Okay, images for him have two levels of signification. Okay, you have a language object system and a meta language system. Okay, and in the language object system, that is concerned with what is denoted in the infographic. And the one I want to use this on here, as you can see, this is from the Daily Mirror from 1964. This is a chart which depicts the frequency of teenage pregnancies, okay, from 1948 up to the 1960s. Okay, so what are we looking at in terms of denotation, in terms of the language object system involved here? Well, we're looking at a line graph, and it's one of those so-called gee-whiz line graphs that doesn't start with a zero base. But it also contains an important visual component to it, an important symbolic component to it, doesn't it? You can see that there's a picture of a man, and he's looking at a woman, and both of them look a little ashen-faced and a little concerned. And of course, the frequency line, the trend line is separating them. And as I say, so that's the depiction. The meta language obviously is to do with connotation, and as I say, you kind of can connote the sense of tension, the sense of concern, the worry that seems to exist between these two characters. And this is a worry that, of course, the mirror is trying to convey is something we should all be concerned about. And this is something really, that goes back to the 19th century and earlier. The idea of young people having kids out of wedlock and not being able to support them, and it being a kind of bit of a moral panic. Okay, so there's a sense of the moral panic in this particular infographic, which, as I say, is delivered via this sense of what we can note from the picture. Okay, so far so good. It's a very simple method of analysis, the Bartian semiotics. The problem, though, is that this method doesn't consider sites of production, sites of consumption, or authorial intention. Okay, so it's really quite a kind of solipsistic approach to understanding visual metaphors. Okay, moving on. A slightly more sophisticated version of semiotics was social semiotics, which really arose on the back of Halliday's research in social semiotics in the 1970s and 80s. And he derived three meta functions from semiotics or categories of meaning making, and these are the interpersonal, which is concerned with maintaining relationships or bonds, the ideational, which is concerned with communicating ideas, and the textual, and that's the process of making ideas and interactions contextual. You know, what is the context in which these symbolic meanings are being transacted? Okay, and you can actually derive quite a sophisticated way of analyzing visual data by taking some of the ideas around social semiotics as they apply to spoken language, and by finding or by kind of like translating those ideas to visual processes. So from speech processes to visual processes. So in visual structuring, for example, it's about actors that do things and goals that have things done to them, and transactions, that is to say, verbs. Okay, so it's about subjects, objects, and verbs, which I'm sure appreciate are the building blocks of spoken language. And so again, you can take some of those ideas and you can apply them to the visualization of data. Now, the data that you're seeing depicted on the graph on the right is one that I wanted to include in my book, but I couldn't actually get copyright clearance in time before the final manuscript was due at the publishers. So I wanted to include this. It's a great infographic and it's got lots of interesting things in it, but I'm going to just use this social semiotics approach to try and tease out some of the meanings that are here, some of the aesthetics that are here. So what is this infographic about? Well, first of all, this is important to say, it's an advert. It's not a news infographic. It's an advert for the British Trawlers Association, okay? Published in 1957. And basically, it's an attempt to try and explain to the consumer, to the Daily Mirror reader, why it is that the price of fish goes up and down at different points in the year. Okay, and here there's a clear attempt to try and explain what's going on. You can see the graph below, and what's basically going on is what they're saying is we can only really effectively trawl for fish at certain points in the year. Okay, and that explains the, if you like, the political economy of why fish cost different prices at different points of the year. It's not some conspiracy against the consumer, and so on. Okay, so that's the basic argument. It's just basically trying to build a bond with the readership. Okay, and that's, I guess you could say, that's the interpersonal metafunction of this graph. You see the housewife with her purse open, and she's looking a bit concerned, or she's maybe not concerned. She's looking a bit quizzical. What's going on? Why is the fish price going up and down? Okay, that's the interpersonal metafunction of this graphic. Now, the ideational metafunction is the idea of basic supply and demand in the ocean. You know, the ships go out at certain times, then they catch the fish and they come back. At other years they can't because it's too risky, storms and gales and what have you. And so that's basically they're naturalizing the political economy of this thing by saying, well, we're bound by the seasons. Basically, that's all we can do. And the textual metafunction here is really about sort of taking the concerned housewife and her concerns and explaining them in terms of the political economy. Of course, what's not mentioned in this graphic are two salient facts, one of which is a phenomenon that you may have heard of called the Cod Wars, and that was where British trawlers used to go into the seas of, I think it was Finland and some other Nordic countries, and basically help themselves to those countries' fish, and it created quite a lot of international tension at the time. And the second factor, of course, is what you might call the indiscriminate nature of fishing back then as well. There's no sense of taking into account the fact sustainability or anything else like that. Shipping back then and fishing back then was much more kind of unapologetically, sort of like corporate and consumerist. Sort of like go out there, get the fish, bring it back, and put it on sale in the shops. Okay, so That's a social semiotic critique of an infographic. And the second of the infographics, I'm just going to very quickly talk about this. You'll notice again, I've got a purple coloring for my heading. Diagrammatics is a method that has emerged from the field of analysis of data visualization. It's also one that draws, though, on the field of semiotics. Okay, so on the one hand, it's a method of analysis that belongs to data visualization, but on the other, it draws on a pre-existing field, in this case, the field of social semiotics. Okay, so the process in diagrammatics is really to think about a visualization in terms of three linguistic categories. The first is pragmatics, and that's the study of use along the mode of correspondence from literal to non-literal. Okay, so that might include graphical metaphor. Okay, the second field is semantics, and that's the study of meanings and the modes of depiction. Again, in this case, there's a scale here. In this case, it's from figurative to non-figurative. That's to do with iconicity. And the third field is to do with syntactics, and that's the study of rules and modes of organization. And you can think of those. This is really where we're beginning to draw in on ideas of, sort of drawing aesthetics and standards together. Okay. And the graph you're looking at on the right is a very simple and plain graph. It was put together by a scientist after the discovery that a doctor called Dr. David Shipman in the UK had been found to be responsible for the deaths of many, many patients. Now you can see it's a very plain graph. It's a classic scientific graph, but actually an inverted version of this, so with the trend lines in white and a background of black, appeared on the Guardian's homepage in 2001, in January 2001, on the top half. So it was clearly used as a very powerful visual metaphor. These graphs are they don't speak to the aesthetics of a situation. They don't speak to the experience of a situation. They're very cold and mechanical and simplistic. But at the same time, sometimes even the most anodyne, the most pared down representation of a fact can be quite chilling. And this is, so you can see it, the black line, the uninterrupted line, is the variable for deaths under Shipman's care, and you can see there's a peak right around the 15th hour, in the afternoon, when most of his patients were effectively killed. And that's the chilling thing about this graph. It's as I say, it's in some respects, it's semantics are non-figurative. Its pragmatics are non-literal. It's purely abstract. But at the same time, the syntactics, the adherence to the standards of best practice, create, in a sense, alongside this visual minimalism, a real sense of chill. What we're looking at here. Okay, so in summary, then, visual studies is a growing field, but it's increasingly fractured and incoherent. You can see there are methods from the arts, there are interdisciplinary methods, and there are methods from different arms of the social sciences. Okay, and some are fractured and they don't work together. Some are very particularistic and bound by particular ways of knowing. And some people feel that though the field of visual studies now as it exists is it's a recognized field, and there are professors of visual studies, that nevertheless, unless we have a way of bringing together different traditions, different fields, that it'll never become a truly coherent site of knowledge. Okay, and of course that's a problem for people like me. Okay, so the research question here is, and the problem here is, how to tie these loose threads together. Okay, and this is a method that I came up with to try to do this. And it's another one that draws upon the field of linguistics. Okay, so first of all, I should say it's a pragmatic method, and it's a way of visualizing data in an open-minded way. It serves, its purpose is to serve to unify approaches of analysis of data visualization. And it's based on the idea of visual data being a text. So we're going back to some of those ideas from Bart and the sort of early semiotics. But fast forward actually to a different writer, to Umberto Eco, and his concern and his philosophical thinking around text containing what he called a multi-level discourse. That is to say, text, if you think of, in this case, a data visualization as being a text, it contains within it a number of different, if you like, competing and alternative voices. Okay, they're all there all the time. Some are more pronounced in some representations than they are in others. And what I call this method is the Tati multi-level discourse method. Okay, and so what I'm basically talking about is when you look at data visualization, okay, it's possible to think of that visualization as comprising a theory or a proof or a method, okay, to explain data. But it's also possible to think of it as an aesthetic. Okay, we just saw in the last example, even the least sort of like elaborate methods of visualization can bring about an aesthetic effect, which can in turn, depending on the data that's presented, create meanings and knowledge that in particular ways. So it's also an aesthetic. The visualization contains a discourse to do with aesthetics. A third discourse is around the idea of visualization being a tool or a means to an end, or a pragmatics, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, and thirdly, there's also an element of ideology, even if whether in some cases the ideology is something that drives what's being seen. Even those graphs that don't have ideology driving the representation of things, there's still an ideological undercurrent, which I'll try to explain as I go. Okay, so against these competing, coexisting discourses, a clear understanding, I hope, of classification is possible. So we get a clearer sense of where the infographic comes from, what are, if it's epistemic priors, and how we can then make sense of those things. And as I say, I'm presenting this idea of a multi-level discourse, the way of building on the work that's already in existence through Manovich's work on cultural analytics and on diagrammatics as a method of analysis. This is my attempt to try and add some additional methodological potential to those methods to try and build a more coherent sense of analysis in the exploration of visual data. So where do these forwards come from? The idea of data visualization as a theory, as an aesthetic, as a tool, and as a idea come from. Okay, so they come, you won't surprise you to learn they come from different approaches to and from different schools and fields of study. The first that considers data visualization as first and foremost a theory. Okay, now this is an idea that really comes through from the fields of statistics, from maths, from the sciences. It's the idea that it's driven really by scientific methodology. Okay, so usually you find it in the works of statisticians, mathematicians, and scientists. It has an intellectual debt to British empiricism and all the way back really to the Aristotelian trust in the senses. Okay, so it's really that sort of empirical approach. Infographics function as monosemi, that is to say, they're formal logic. Okay, so issues to do with symbolism, to do with rotation, just don't really exist in this way of understanding infographics. So they're primarily the conventions. They are considered with, as I say, monosemi. There's little space for non-logical elements, such as the symbolic, the cultural, the compositional, and there's no or little consideration of audience effect. Okay, so this is the first body of knowledge that really focuses in, not, doesn't exclude entirely the others, but really sort of like focuses in on importance, the centrality of theory that data visualization represents. The second field, what I call the expressionist aesthete field, is really driven by one figure, again, a name I'm sure you're all very familiar with, David McCandless. There are others who draw upon these ideas. I know from the empirical work I've done before that David McCandless's ideas are very popular in newsrooms. So here really is a focus on the aesthetics of visualization, okay, and it's really informed by postmodern thought and by degrees with you could trace some of these ideas back to the aesthetic sensibilities of fantasiacal writers like Oscar Wilde, for example, whose father, incidentally, was also who created a couple of quite important maps. Anyway, the emphasis on the expressionist aesthete approach here is on experimentalism, okay, by trying different things, and on fun, you know, sort of learning, acquiring knowledge through the process of experimentation and so on. Now, of course, again, being familiar with McCandless's work, you'll also be familiar with the various criticisms that arise around this notion of fun and play and so on and so forth at the expense of best practice, at the expense potentially misleading people. Okay, nevertheless, the pioneering and innovation make it popular, and so it's a discourse in its own right. And in this discourse, the infographic is first and foremost not a theory, but rather an aesthetic. Okay, the pragmatist realist. Okay, I imagine that quite a few of you might recognize yourself here, especially if those of you who work in industry, especially those of you who work in the media. The pragmatist realist approach to infographics focuses in on the idea of infographics as being a tool, a means to an end. Okay, it's influenced by the field of American pragmatism and particularly by the philosophy of John Dewey, the educational philosophy. Okay, and it's really concerned with it sort of foregrounds the idea of people learning in an active way. Okay, so people engaging in media in an active rather than a passive way. Okay, and you find the spirit of pragmatist realism in infographics often and data visualizations in media. This is where infographics and data visualizations are conceived of as a form of visual journalism. Okay, so if you think about, again, the aesthetics and the ethics of this field, this discourse, really there's a tension between the journalistic ethics, you know, that have arisen over the years, that are kind of like that journalists cling to, and the standards of best practice that have emerged in the sciences. Okay, so these two sort of ethical fields kind of coexist with each other, and sometimes there are tensions between these two things depending on the audience that you're trying to communicate with, right? So best practice really draw both on positivist traditions from the sciences and on liberal journalistic ethics and values about communicating with your audience and being clear with your audience. So it's concerned with the audience that is, not the audience that ought to be. Okay, so that's what makes it pragmatic. And really it's about figurative representations functioning according to polysemy, okay, and the different meanings that exist for different audiences. Okay, so that's the third discourse. And the final discourse, I hope you'll all recognize the infographic on the right. This is, of course, isotype. Now, of course, Naurath, or the Nauraths rather, and their other proteges and colleagues, didn't see themselves as being nakedly ideological in what they were doing in terms of, you know, sort of propagandistically ideological, but nevertheless, the whole purpose of isotype was in order to, you know, conceived of as a means of providing visual arguments to help members of the public in Red Vienna in the 1930s to understand what their politicians were doing and what they were doing, to make changes, you know, and ideally to change society for what Naurath thought was the better, you know, to lead towards a kind of socialist revolution. And so in this discourse, infographics are ideologically purposive. They're a means to an end. Okay, so they're really ideological first and everything else second, although that's unfair in this case to Naurath, of course, because he did adhere to a simple but trusted method of standards in isotype. The key influences here are Marx, logical positivism and the modern art sensibilities. And here, as I say, the infographic is not exclusively, but first and foremost, ideological. Okay, so in conclusion, all infographics I will contain all of these discourses, but often in a hierarchy and with discourses kind of, you know, some discourses being quite hidden, other discourses being quite prominent in different forms. The categorical emphasis of these four voices, for want of a better word, I argue is a function of variation in style. And between these at times competing discourses, the outline of different forms, genres, or classes of data visualization or infographic can be observed. And lastly, this awareness of style or genre can then be combined with other methods for a more comprehensive analysis. Okay, so thanks for listening. I hope you're still there. I feel like I've been talking for quite a long time. I have. Apologies. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now and just for a bit. Okay.
I'm muted. I always forget I'm muted and then I talk and talk. Thank you, Murray, for your talk. It was fascinating. I had no idea Oscar Wilde's father designed maps. Now I have to make a few research. Now, people, please ask your questions. I'll start with a bit of one of my own. Because you teach and I teach, and I know for a fact that some people watching at home also teach. And I'm curious about what you think about the teaching of data visualization or the teaching of visual studies. It can often be practice-based or focus too much on processes and tools and ways of doing. Do you think there's room to teach these kind of more philosophical questions, to think, to teach students about how to think about these questions more than do visualization?
That's a very interesting. It's an interesting question, but it's one that I can only answer from my own vantage point. And the problem I think may be here that because we live in a world where we all come from our different kind of professional backgrounds, right? So my pre-academic background really was in journalism, and that's what I understood. And a lot of my understanding, I guess, of the world around me is based around the things I learned in the field of journalism. But of course, data visualization draws on people working in many different fields, doesn't it? You've got people studying statistics and maths and the earth sciences who are developing really sophisticated methods of visualization, and then of course architect as well, and so again in architecture you're drawing on the arts and you're drawing on the crafts and so on and so forth, and it's just such a fascinating and wide-ranging field. Now the question is, given the disparity, I guess, that will exist between the students that I teach and what I need to teach them in a practical sense, is really quite basic. All I really need to teach my students is how to spot dodgy scaling or what have you. And so consequently, there's lots of time to talk about the history, talk about the ethics, talk about the aesthetics and so on. But absolutely, you're right. There must be a way. I guess we need to develop a pedagogy that speaks to the different ways that data visualize with these discrete fields, which again come from very different ways of thinking about knowledge, ways of thinking about what's true, things, and that's a challenge, right? It's a real challenge.
Yeah, thanks. And it's in the essence of a methodology. This like group of so different people. We have a question from the audience. George asks a very good question as well. He wants to know, would you say that a perfect data visualization or infographic does not exist without the harmonious work of a designer and a journalist/analyst? As in my reading, data visualization without a designer is skewed visually, and without a journalist or analyst is skewed by content.
Yeah, well, I guess what it comes down to is to what extent do you want to involve your audience in the process of design? And again, we think journalistically. Okay, so journalists have gone through different phases of thinking about their audience in different ways, right? Now, when I was at the BBC, sort of like 15, 16, 17 years ago, I occasionally used to do research up in the nations and regions in the different BBC studios. And I can remember one time I went up somewhere up north, and I went into the newsroom and I prepared to train the journalists who are working in the newsroom. And when I got in there, I noticed there was like a cardboard cutout of a man in his 50s with grey hair. It was life-sized. And he had a name, okay? And he had his demographic data, what his age was, what his background was, what his education level was, what his pastimes and hobbies were. And this was at a time when BBC management thought that a good way for their journalists to know about the audience was to find this kind of representation of the average listener. And when you think about it now, you think this is absolutely crazy. What were you thinking of? How can you possibly write every line of your news story for this person who's standing over your shoulder? But at the same time, it's interesting, isn't it? Because usually when we think of when as a journalist, if you read the overnights, if you read the statistics, if you and so on and so forth, you get a very abstract idea of what people are actually interested in the news and what they want to know, right? But the visualization is interesting. It adds an extra level, doesn't it? It's like the reader over your shoulder, the listener over your shoulder, the person who's going to consume your data visualization over your shoulder, right? So to answer the question, I think journalists and journalism studies has something valuable to tell us about how people consume infographics, and that's clearly important. But it's not always right. Journalists make mistakes. Journalists have got to learn from the mistakes that they make. Yeah. And so it's constant. But so to answer the question, I think undoubtedly there has to be a coming together of maybe not journalists, but certainly someone who understands something about communication and about how people engage with things, because there's no doubt in my mind that the approach that they call naive empiricism, the idea that information explains itself, that just doesn't happen. It's just not true. Human beings are far too complex. They're far too varied. There are far too many pressures on their time for anyone to assume that the message that you convey will be interpreted in the same way by everyone that finds your message. It's not real, from my experience, and again on the empirical research that I've seen. Okay.
Yeah. And it's very true, especially when our journalists saying different things and how we are seeing news nowadays. It's very poignant. We have another question from the audience. Sarah asks, do you identify with a particular one of the discourses you propose?
I'm quite taken with social semiotics. I like the idea of taking concepts from the ways that we communicate, particularly verbal communication, and mapping those to the visual. I love the idea of it, and in fact, if you read these scholars in social semiotics, some of the ideas they have are just really fascinating. Really detailed ways of thinking about how different visual components can come together and kind of the meanings and sometimes the meanings are really quite unintuitive, but they're there. The association between say a figure in a graphic who's moving somewhere or looking in a particular direction, and you have a secondary figure who's perhaps in a passive position and who's perhaps the subject of the gaze, and then the verb itself, which often, as you appreciate, is often in graphics is often a trend line. And some of those ways of thinking about graphics can be really powerful, and as I say, they yield really useful and interesting knowledge. Yeah. But diagrammatics, I must say, as well, is another one that I find interesting. I don't know if you picked up on it, but I'm not really a big fan of cultural studies. I don't really see the value in foregrounding ideology over everything else. It's just not part of my makeup. It's not what I am. So yeah, if I've got a favorite, it's probably social semiotics. If I've got a least favorite, it's probably cultural studies.
Okay. Two answers in one question. I love it. I think it goes well with another question from the audience. You mentioned social semiotics, and João asks, when we look at these, do you believe that some of these methods lead to more accurate or truthful conclusions than others?
Yeah, I do. But again, I'm using truthful in a. I guess I'm using truthful in a. In an interpretive way rather than an objectivist way. Again, I can't really get my head around a methodology that has essentially decided what it's going to find before you actually do the research. It seems almost counterintuitive. What's the point? I don't understand it. And again, I know I work with some colleagues who do take that approach, and I speak to them. And I understand where they come from, but it just doesn't sit with me. So I can't deal with it basically.
I think it's very funny because it happens sometimes. We like to know what our answers are before posing the questions.
Exactly.
I'm going to finish with one from, not from me exactly, but from Data Visualization Lisboa, because we often have this discussion about what data vis means and what it is to us, and we most of the times don't agree. Do you think that these courses can help us reach an understanding among us?
I'm going to be honest. I don't think they will, because ultimately the process of interpretation will always necessarily require that different people come to it from different perspectives. However, as a caveat, what I will say is this method of analysis is intended to do is to formalize a way of thinking about the different, as I say, the different voices that exist in all of the areas that have if you like, a stake in data visualization. Method, the idea of method, the idea of ideology, the idea of aesthetic, the idea of pragmatics. All of those things have a vested interest in visualization per se. Okay. And if it's possible to discern those different things in different visualizations, then it does at least allow you to get a sense of where it's coming from, and also give you a sense of it's a means of categorization. Now, categorization is not everything, but it can be useful, right? And it's better, I think, to have something systematic like that rather than to have a more vague way of understanding the different ways of thinking about categories.
Thank you. So I guess we'll keep having this conversation.
For sure.
Marie, thank you so much for giving such a wonderful talk and such fascinating insights.
Thanks for having me.
Philosophical questions. Yeah, have a nice rest of your vacation.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Goodbye.
Bye.
So everybody, it is time for a few announcements. So we are going on a summer break. We will be resting for August, but preparing for a very special semester. Earlier this month, we welcomed Barbara Emanuel to kick off our very first large initiative, which is the Latin America Special Season. That's right, from September to December, we will dedicate the meetups and our newsletter to showcase practitioners and practices in all countries across Latin America. We have been to Brazil already, but there's much more yet to come, so stay tuned. Before we go on our summer break, let me tell you about our newsletter, which is Pastel de Data. We'll have, although we are going on a summer break, we will have an August edition. So subscribe if you don't want to miss either July or August. That are still to come. In next events, if you like data-centered competitions, you'll be excited to hear about two upcoming datathons. The first is the Portuguese Football Federation Datathon, and you will work with data from the Portuguese Football Observatory. It will happen in September, so you have to apply before July 31st. And the second is Hacker City, which has happened before and will return this September in Porto, which is a lovely, lovely city in north of Portugal, where I come from. So that's all, folks. Thanks for being with us today, and we'll be back in September. Don't forget, subscribe to our channel, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on socials. It was a pleasure. Bye, everybody. See you in September.